Okay, so earlier, hopefully people are watching these in order. I'll post them all tomorrow at some point. But today we're finishing up talking about trifles, and then we will segue very quickly into a discussion, hopefully a quick discussion of the essay. You've already written 2 essays for me, and I'm trying desperately to get them all graded. And it will take me a long time, but I will hopefully get them all graded by next Tuesday, which is the last day. I mean, I'll work a little on Wednesday of next week, but I work fully on Monday and Tuesday. So just know that we don't have class next week at all. There are no due dates next week at all, but I will still be in the office Monday and Tuesday of next week. So if you have a question or you run into issues or whatever, you can always email me or call me and I will answer. But let's talk about, we were talking about this murder mystery, that was Mr. Wright being strangled in his bedroom with a rope. It sounds like Clue, but it's not. And we covered kind of how Mr. Hale found the body, and he was directed up into the bedroom by Mrs. Wright, who was rocking and acting really weird and kind of like not like she wasn't really all there. And so Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, Mrs. Peters is the sheriff's wife, are kind of going through a lot of her things on the surface, and primarily to get her some stuff to take back to the jail so that she has another set of clothes, and because they kind of just took her and arrested her and took her to jail, and so she didn't really have any of her stuff. And she asked specifically about an apron, and then she was also really worried about her jarred fruits and stuff in the cupboard because it was going to get really cold, and she was worried, and actually most of them got destroyed. But this whole play really covers this, here's the investigation of the official people, all the men, and they're trying to find who could have done it and with what motive. And then at the same time, we have a parallel event of the 2 women going through her things and essentially finding all the clues and interpreting the clues pretty correctly because they're women and they live, they work in that women's world in this very stratified society. And so they're recognizing clues that the men don't recognize. And we just got to the moment where, and this is really the climax. Remember, we talked about Freytag's pyramid. I'm going to stick him in here again. And that's the where it starts with the exposition, and then we have an inciting incident, which in this case, the inciting incident happened before the play did. Then we have this rising action. Here come these people, they're investigating everything, and we're getting clue upon clue upon clue that's pointing to the fact that Mr. Wright was really awful, and he was not a good husband, and he probably did some really awful things to her. And the clues finally culminate in finding a bird cage and then a bird, and the bird has its neck wrung. Now, right at this point is where the climax happens, because the women now have all these different clues that they've been finding while the men have been investigating elsewhere. And so the county attorney comes in, and as they come back in, Mrs. Hale takes the box with the dead bird in it and hides it in the sewing basket under the quilt pieces, hoping they're not going to look through the quilt. They'll look at the quilt pieces and go, it's just a quilt, and not dig into it, which is probably what's going to happen. And then the county attorney mocks them by saying, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or not it? That's the quilt they were making. Well, she was making. And they said, we think she was going to knot it. And both women know what that means, and the entire audience knows what that means. And this is where we get a little bit of irony, because the comment makes a lot of sense to us, and yet the men don't get it. So there might even be somebody in the audience who laughs about it because they know what that means. It means that she decided she was going to kill her husband and knot the rope around his neck. And yet the county attorney doesn't get it at all. And so this is actually, this whole situation is an element of dramatic irony. And it's a very common thing used in plays. You'll probably see it in other ways too. And it's usually a case where we know things as an audience, watching the play happen, that the actors don't know. Well, the actors know, but the characters don't know. And so they'll go in and say something that they think is super intelligent, but because we know something else, we can laugh at them, or we can go, ooh, because we know they're going to realize later on that they made a mistake. And it's you can call it situational irony, but really it's dramatic irony. And it's meant to make it so that we're in on a joke that other people don't know, that other characters on the stage don't know. So we've been given this chance. All these men went off first up into the bedroom and then out to the barn. And while they're gone, the women find all this stuff. So we are in on that. We are the other women. And it's funny that we're all women, but we're the women watching this, and it's like we're part of this group, and we recognize the signs of his abuse, especially emotional abuse, but possibly even physical, since he obviously took the bird out of the cage and wrung its neck. And so rather than give these clues to the men, this is where the actual climax happens. The women choose to hide it. Why? So that she doesn't end up in jail or executed even for murdering her husband when her husband made her life horrible. So they're recognizing that she was essentially sent over the edge by her husband's ill treatment. He tried to kill everything that was happy in her life. And so she lost her mind and killed him. And that's essentially where we're getting to. Now, they don't outright say any of this, but it's all these little clues that just kind of add up. Now, the county attorney, after this joke of the not it part, he says he notices the bird cage, which they found in a cupboard. And he goes, has the bird flown? Because obviously there's nothing in the cage. And that was, they were looking, why would there be a bird cage with no bird? And of course, they found the bird, and the bird had been, its neck had been broken. But the answer, when it says, has the bird flown, Mrs. Hale, who, remember, also hid the bird, she says immediately, she puts more quilt pieces over the box, so she's covering it up even more, right in front of them. And she says, we think the cat got it. And the county attorney says, is there a cat? And Mrs. Hale glances at Mrs. Peters like, oh, that's not a very good lie. And Mrs. Peters says, well, not now. They're superstitious, They leave, which is not a good lie either. And yet, what does the county attorney say? Nothing. He just goes back to Sheriff Peters. Like, what the women are saying is silly, and he just dismisses all of it. He ignores the signs that are right in front of him. And honestly, the fact that there's a bird cage and there's no bird, what the heck is that? Why doesn't he ask more questions about it? We don't get the answer to that. But remember, he sees all of these little things, the bird cage, the quilt, even her apron, and all the other stuff, the fact that the kitchen's messy. He just sees that as all trivial. It's a trifle. These are not real clues. They're play clues, and the women are just simple creatures who look at trivial things and think that they're important. And so he's very dismissive. And that's actually going to help them, that they're so easily dismissed. So he goes, there's no sign at all of anyone having come from the outside. So remember, was there a break-in? Did somebody break into the house? He says it was their own rope. So the rope that was used around the guy's neck was one that he owned. But remember, they always also talked about the fact that there was a gun in the house. So why didn't somebody just use the gun? Well, they would assume that if a man wanted to kill somebody, that he would use a gun. Would a woman? And that's a big question. And certainly for this playwright, I think the assumption is that no, a woman probably wouldn't. In fact, what's the typical way that a woman kills a man? Or stereotypical way that a woman can kill a man? Poison, exactly. Because she cooks, so she could just slip the poison into his food, but that's not how he died. And yet from the little clues we have about his rope around his neck, it doesn't sound like it was somebody who just did it with brute force. it was twisted around some things and kind of used as leverage to strangle him. And it was done while he was sleeping. And so could she have done it? Yeah. So they're gonna literally go back upstairs. And when they do, Mrs. Peters they're both kind of freaked out because they know what they've done. And they're essentially creating the story. What is it that happened now that they have time to talk about it freely? And so Mrs. Hale says she liked the bird. She was going to bury it in that pretty box. Okay, so that's why it was in the box. She's trying to, this whole time she's trying to figure out, why was it in the sewing thing? Why was it hidden, underneath the quilt things? Why was it in a pretty box if it was a dead bird? And so she's saying this is why. She cherished the bird. The bird meant something to her. You think about kids too, when you're burying a fish that dies or something when the kids are little, you don't flush it down the toilet in front of the kids. Like you may have some little, ceremony for it, and then you pretend you're burying it in the backyard or something. Or maybe you even do, but you try to be respectful of how close the kids were to the animal that died, especially even if it's a fish, because kids get attached. So she was going to bury it for real. And then Mrs. Peters says, when I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy took a hatchet, and before my eyes, before I could get there, and what happened? She doesn't even say it. But what did the boy do to her kitten?
He killed it.
He killed it. It's probably chopped its neck and cut off its head with an axe right in front of her, which is the ultra horrifying. But then she says, if they hadn't held me back, I would have hurt him. In other words, at that point, when this stupid boy became violent and cruel and killed the thing that she really cherished and loved, her kitten, helpless thing, she could have hurt him. Her response was so angry and so upset and so insane even. She was not in her right mind, and she could have hurt him. And then Mrs. Hale says, and she had already mentioned kids before, that it would be easier to clean up, but it would be lonely. And she says, I wonder how it would seem never to have had any children around. No, Wright wouldn't like the bird, a thing that sang. She used to sing, he killed that too. And so she's like, okay, he wouldn't have liked the bird because it made noise. She would have loved the bird because it resembled her. And yet, just like the bird, he killed the joy and the singing in her. And so she would see it, she would identify with the bird if he came and attacked it. And then Mrs. Peters says, well, we don't know who killed the bird. And Mrs. Hale says, I knew John Wright. Now, notice how they don't like spell everything out. They just, if she said that though, I knew John Wright. In other words, we may not know for sure. John Wright could have done it, is what she's saying. Now, she doesn't say that though. She just suggests it. It's all in, it's going to, so much is going to come out in their facial expression, in the way that they say these words. And then Mrs. Peters says, it was an awful thing was done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale, killing a man while he slept. So she's trying to argue that they should reveal what happened. So this was a bad thing, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him. And Mrs. Hale says, his neck choked the life out of him. Just like the bird. In other words, this is retribution. Or he's getting the same thing done to him that he did to the bird. And then Mrs. Peters said, we don't know who killed him. We don't know. Like, she's kind of upset that if this was the Mrs. Wright, then they're covering it up. And that makes her really freaked out because she's the sheriff's wife. And Mrs. Hale says, if there'd been years and years of nothing, then a bird to sing to you, it would be awful still. after the bird was still. So she had like a little over a year ago, or around a year ago, she had she got a bird. Suddenly she had any joy, and he killed it. And Mrs. Peters says, I know what stillness is. When my first baby died after he was 2 years old, and me with no other than, and so she's saying she understands what it's like to lose something that's dear. And so then she says, this is Mrs. Hale saying, how soon do you suppose they'll be through looking for the evidence? And she says, I know what's, so Mrs. Peters is very much on the fence. She knows how it must feel. But then she says, the law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale. And Mrs. Hale is, this is all an argument. Mrs. Hale is trying to convince Mrs. Peters we can't reveal what we found, ever. We can't essentially throw our own woman, one of our own, to the wolves when she was already thrown to the wolves for years and years and years because she had to live with this man. So she says, I wish, today, of course, we have, you can say, well, I only did it because, and this is what he did to me. This is when he beat me. This is when he, broke my arm. This is when he, so much of that kind of stuff is documented. Would she necessarily get away with it? Not totally, but she would at least get a reduced sentence, and she might get away because it would be seen as some type of defense, self-defense. She was afraid he was going to, he killed the bird and he was going to kill her. So she could certainly do that in a court of law today. Back then, they really didn't have this kind of thing. Unless somebody was coming at you with a gun and people saw, you couldn't really claim that kind of self-defense thing. And so they're kind of going through all of this, though, very slowly. But Mrs. Hale is saying, look, if you'd known Minnie Foster when she was not married and you saw her today, oh my gosh, there's no comparison. And she says, oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that? Like, it's her fault that because she made it even lonelier because she didn't come over. And then Mrs. Peters is like, okay, let's calm down. We mustn't take on. And she says, I might have known she needed help. So Mrs. Hale is actually dealing with a level of guilt because she lived right next door. Now, of course, it wasn't right next door, but, down the road a bit. But she could have come over and she didn't. And so this girl was all by herself. She says, we live close together and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's just a different kind of the same thing. And then she says, if I was you, because remember that Mrs. Peters is the sheriff's wife, she's going to take the package back to Mrs. Wright in jail. I wouldn't tell her the fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this in to prove it to her. And so they're going to take the jar that didn't get cracked in the frozen overnight in the freeze, but says she may never know whether it was broke or not. In other words, she may never get out of jail. And then Mrs. Peters says, my, it's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh, getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary, as if that could have anything to do with wouldn't they laugh? Now, Mrs. Peters is doing something. What is she doing? Does she believe that the bird means nothing?
No.
No. But she is rationalizing that the bird really is trivial, that it's just a trifle. And the men would just laugh if the women made anything of it. Just like they would laugh. They laughed about the quilt. They laughed about the jars of canned fruit. They laughed about, they'll laugh about all of it because they see it all as silly. That the women are paying attention to such stupid things. And so she says, oh, they just laugh at us if we even brought it up, which is her excuse for not telling them. And Mrs. Hale said, maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. Like, I don't know what they do. And then here comes the county attorney again. It's all men's time now. It's perfectly clear. So this is what he's saying. He says, no, Peters, it's perfectly clear, except a reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up with this strange way of doing it. In other words, he's saying, the woman's guilty. There's no other way because there's no clear sign of an intruder. There's no, blah, blah, blah. But without real evidence of why she'd do it, juries won't convict her. That's what he's saying. Like, he wants, if I could get some evidence and do something, make a story that would convince a jury, that's what I need. And then the women, right at that moment, the women's eyes meet for an instant. And they don't speak up. And so the county attorney says, okay, well, I'm going to stick around for a while. And the sheriff says, do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in? And the lawyer goes to the table, picks up the apron and laughs. Oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out. And he moves a few things about and disturbs the quilt pieces. But he doesn't do anything. He says, no, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters? And she says, not just that way. The sheriff says, married to the law. And he says, I just want you to come in here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at these windows. Oh, windows. And he goes off. And what happens? Mrs. Hale rises. This is all in stage direction. Of course, in a modern play, they might not even say all of this. But Mrs. Hale rises, looks intensely at Mrs. Peters, whose eyes make a slow turn, finally meeting Mrs. Hale's. A moment Mrs. Hale holds her, then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly, Mrs. Peters throws back the quilt pieces and tries to put the box in the bag she is wearing. It's too big. She opens the box, starts to take the bird out, cannot touch it, goes to pieces, stands there helpless. The knob is turning. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and puts it in the pocket of her big coat. So they are absolutely hiding evidence at this point. Now, Mrs. Peters tried to. She literally tried to, but couldn't fit it in the thing. And then, so Mrs. Hale, just as the knob is turning, Mrs. Hale takes it and stuffs it in her coat. And then the last thing he does, the county attorney turns to the women who just took the evidence, the most compelling piece of evidence, and hid it. And they're going to get rid of it. And he says, at least we found out that she was not going to quilt it. She was going to, what is it you called it, ladies? And Mrs. Hale even puts a hand over the pocket where she's hiding the bird. And she says, we call it not it, Mr. Henderson. And that's the end. So what do you think of their choice? Now it's time for you guys to talk. And you can type it in the, remember, you don't have to turn on a microphone, but you can. But you can type in there, type in the chat box, whatever you wanted to do. Whatever you think. What do you think of their choice? Yeah, we get it, and we get why, and yet it should leave us feeling uncomfortable. Do you think the women are totally comfortable with their choice? Do you think they're thinking, ha ha, got away with it? Nope. I don't think they do. I think they're very uncomfortable with their choice, in the same way that if I were in that situation, honestly, I don't know what I would do. I don't know. I have no idea. I could say, oh, I would never hide evidence, but because I tend to be a very upstanding, extremely ethical, moral person, but it does leave me uncomfortable. And yet the evidence points, I mean, yes, it points to her guilt, but it also points to why and what he must have done. and how that must have felt. And yet in today's world, the prosecuting attorney, yeah, I mean, there's, will she ever be normal again? She probably won't. Like, she's probably messed up for good. And most of it isn't because she killed her husband, it's because of the way she was treated for the last 20 something years, because he was awful. And the truth is a lot of people don't get over that. But in today's, court of law, the fact that she waited until he fell asleep to wrap the rope around his, I mean, that shows that she wasn't in the heat of the moment, that she actually planned it. And that would get her a higher sentence. Yeah, I mean, the fact that she doesn't have to live with him anymore totally makes sense. And who knows, we don't know, like they didn't have any, the men didn't at least notice anything about, was she bruised? But at the same time, it wasn't until, I'm trying to think of when the rule of thumb ended. Do you guys know what the rule of thumb is? Have you heard of that, the rule of thumb?
No.
Okay, you have not. Have either of the other two, Addie, Samaya, have you heard of the rule of thumb? Okay, well, it was almost a law. It was really an understood law. And the rule of thumb was that a man could, and I'll just type it in here really quick, the rule of thumb. It changed once the women's rights movement kind of moved forward in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. But the rule of thumb was that a man could legally, could get away with it. He could beat his children or his child or his wife to death, and he would have the right to do so and not go to jail for it, as long as he didn't beat them with anything bigger than, or bigger around than, his thumb. So if he had a stick that was the size of his thumb or smaller, he could literally beat them to a pulp and get away with it, because he was obeying, if he took something bigger, a huge club or something, and then beat them and they died, well, then that was too big. And so he needed to go to jail. But the truth is there was a lot of leeway for men as the authoritarian. That is not at all the case today. Well, and we don't know. The truth is mental, psychological, and emotional abuse are so much worse. They don't necessarily kill you, but they're horribly devastating. So that whole idea of, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me, that's so wrong, because they do. And emotional abuse is so much harder to treat. And we didn't, of course, they didn't have all the people who could be treated. Back then everybody didn't go to therapy or something like that. Hardly anybody goes today, but lots more people go. But there was just no understanding of that. So the isolation is huge. And the fact that the only person she ever saw was him is really toxic. And so we have no idea what her state of mind is. We really don't. And the fact that she is worrying about her canned fruit when she's in jail for murder says that she's not all there. And so you could absolutely, and at that time too, there's a lot of sympathy, but there's also a lot of belief that women just simply can't do things like this. Now, much of it is because statistically, we don't. We are far less likely to be serial killers, to be mass murderers, even to kill. And we're far less likely to be, on death row or something like that for this kind of a crime. But that's just because men are more likely to do this. It's not because women never do it. It's because men just do it. They more commonly do it. Let me put it that way. So the truth is even the fact that, if she's capable of this, many juries would just see her as insane, because women don't do that. And so if she did it, then she really must be crazy. But a lot of them simply can't go there. They can't get to the point where they look at a woman and think of, and she's a pretty small, slender woman, from what they say, would she be able to physically do it? And a lot of people would just say, no, she can't. And that's what kind of goes back to the, that person, remember the person who was up for trial that I talked about, Lizzie Borden, last time? Lizzie Borden was actually put on trial for this. And a bunch of the populace, the population, from the media and everything else really thought, wow, then she probably did it, But then the court case, it ended up, she never was convicted. And for a lot of people, it was just this idea, could a woman be capable of picking up an axe and really killing people with it? And a lot of people just simply couldn't imagine it. So, and we don't know. There is no definitive evidence that says that Lizzie Borden did it. We just don't have anybody else who was an option at the time. It doesn't mean that someone else didn't do it. We just don't know. So, but again, people couldn't go for it. Do you guys have any other comments about this? Any other things? Okay, you want to just switch to you ready to switch to the essay? Yes. Hopefully you are. Yeah, I think it's one of those plays. We memorized a few, like I was Mrs. Hale. I was Mrs. Peters in when I was in, like, I don't know, ninth grade or something, theater class. And somebody else was, and I kept saying Mrs. Hale, and it sounded like hell, which I thought was really weird, and it made me uncomfortable. But I was a very weird ninth grader. So, okay, so let me go ahead and stop sharing this. But it's a very interesting, I don't like the story as much. I like the play better because the story tells too much. It reveals too much about people's motivations and things like that. And the play just gives us the dialogue, and it's much more interesting, I think. So let's share the assignment. Okay, so this is the drama comparison essay. Now, up until this point, you've had an option every time. You could write a short story based on another short story, or write a poem based on another poem, but that's not an option this time. So it's really just going to be a comparison. But it's a little bit different because what you're going to do is choose one of the plays and an aspect within them, something that's going on in the plays. It doesn't make any difference which one of the plays you choose. So you can use trifles, but you're going to look at a theme within that play, and then you're going to find one of the short stories or one of the poems that you think really that same type of theme is popping out, and look at how it shows up in one versus how it shows up in the other. So if you've already written a comparison essay like that, then this is just going to be one more of the same. If you haven't, it's not that hard. The main thing is that once you pick whatever it is, that you find another work. I mean, maybe there's some aspect of trifles, or since you're reading The Doll's House right now, feel free, as you go through and read it, is there something in that you find interesting? Maybe you feel like there's more to write about. I don't know. But you can look at friendship in there. Friendship it's sort of in this one, and even this list of themes, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger just because I can. Whoa, not that big. I can't. I have no control over how my biginator. Okay, there we go. But if you look at, for instance, some of these themes won't show up in every play, but I can absolutely tell you, if you find, and you could, if you really wanted to, you could compare one play to another play. I just didn't want you to have to read all of the plays first and then, choose two of the three, because sometimes you're not going to find one that really compares well. But you can go back to the short stories, or you can go back to the poems, and you can look at, so if you're talking about things like Love Destroyed, I don't know that really pops up in trifles. It absolutely pops up in The Doll's House. Absolutely. And so if you decide that's what you want to talk about, you can certainly look at things like, or you can even, compare Mrs. Wright and Mr. Wright's relationship. They get married, and what was their marriage like, and compare it to oh, I don't know, Desiree's Baby, or compare it to Story of an Hour, or something that has another marriage situation, and how does that turn out? If you're talking about insanity, obviously trifles would work, but you would have to go back into, and you could look at Sylvia Plath's Daddy or something like that, and remember that she wrote to her father who had died when she was 10, but then she kept attempting suicide, and then she married a person, divorced him, and then she did commit suicide actually. Once he announced that he was marrying somebody else, and it was not long after that that she committed suicide. So it could be something like that. You could certainly look at, I mean, friendship, and that's going to be in all three plays. I mean, some of it is the two women and their, affinity, they're trying to be a friend to Mrs. Wright. You could look at friendship in a short story that goes with it. You could also look at, there's friendship, there's a two women and two men who are friends in A Doll's House. And then there are quite a few people in The Tempest that you could use as far as friendship. Parent-child relationships also come up, not so much in this play, but they come up in the next play, and it's mostly talking about parents. Well, actually, in the case of the marriage, it is a parent-child relationship where one person pretends to be the parent and parents the other one and treats them like a child or a doll. In The Tempest, there's a dad. Prospero is the main character, and his daughter is in the play, Miranda. And so he has to, he raised her all by himself and on this island and stuff like that. So you can look at that. And that could compare to several of our stories that talk about parents and children. So think about what theme you find interesting. And so I would suggest before you choose this, at least read A Doll's House. And even better, if next week or something, because we have nothing going on, read The Tempest and get all that stuff out of the way. And then all you have to do after that, when you come back, if you've already turned in the journals, then all you have to worry about is the paper and the test. And honestly, if you wanted to take the test early and just get it over with and turn in the paper and then be done with the semester, you could totally do that. Just tell me and I will set the test up so you can take it early. So the truth is you decide which of the plays you want to write about and what theme you want to do. And this is not an all-inclusive thing. It is not. I mean, I do talk a lot about, and you could talk about lies. You could talk about, and the reasons for those lies, good lies versus bad lies or whatever. You could talk about the past versus the present. How do you get over what happened in the past and deal with what happens now? That's very much a theme in both A Doll's House and in The Tempest. So the truth is there's a lot you could do. So if you're not sure what you want to do but you think of a theme and you're like, oh my gosh, this theme, I really liked it. Feel free. If you want to write, honestly, if there was a short story you wrote about and you really like that short story, like, I don't know, The Horse Dealer's Daughter or something like that, there may be something in it that could link to one of these plays too. So you can go backwards if you want to. But all you're finding, essentially your paper is going to be an intro that talks all about the theme and how it comes out in both of these two works, whatever play you've chosen, and then whatever poem or short story you've chosen. And then half of the paper is discussion of the short story or poem, half the paper is a discussion of the play, and then comparing the two together, and that's the end of the paper. The main thing, though, make sure you have 4 sources. 2 of them are going to be the play and the short story or poem, and the other 2 are just, you can have them about the author, you can have it about, it doesn't have to be, it can be about the theme. Honestly, it says, find something else about the work. You don't have to do that. It can totally be about the theme. If we're talking about lies, go look it up in a psychology index or something and see what the effects of lies on a human psyche. That would be probably more illuminating if you're talking about lies than finding something about trifles or something about A Doll's House. So just make sure you have 4 sources total, the 2 works and then 2 extra works. And make sure whenever you quote from the play or from the short story that you do so thoroughly, do it the way that we've been learning. And let me go ahead and I'm going to open up a new, let's see, just do a new document. And I want to do a little bit about quoting the play, because in a lot of ways, actually what I can do, the play should, when you quote a play and you're quoting, you can either quote lines of a person, like if you said, Mrs. Hale said, and then just quote her directly. I should have come more often. I'll just say visited more often. I'm just making that because that's not exactly what she said. And then go on with whatever your sentence is. But if you're going to talk about an exchange of things, I'm just going to stop the sharing for a second. And let's share this for a second. And I'll just show you what so if you're, and you can quote what she does at the end, like this whole section where Mrs. Hale, is motioning to the box, and Mrs. Peters tries to put it in, in the bag, and it won't fit. And so she's freaking out and starts crying. And then Mrs. Hale grabs it and stuffs it in her coat. So you can quote all of that, but you would block that quotation. Same thing if you were quoting this kind of stuff. So if you decided to quote the sheriff, at this end, the sheriff and the county attorney or whatever, not that you would want to cite that, but if you're quoting Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale exchanging something, you would actually do Mrs. Peters centered, put all her stuff in there, and then put Mrs. Hale's name centered and put all of her words in next. It would be a blocked quotation. And so does that make sense to you guys? Or
Yes.
okay. So all that means is it's going to look, it's still going to be double spaced just like normal, but you're tabbing it in a full inch, and you won't put quotes around it. You'll just keep it in exactly the same format, just like you do with poetry. Remember I said to block the quotation and just make it, the lines look exactly like they looked in the original poem. That's what you want to do. And that way it keeps its format as much as possible. Okay. So Samaya says you do. Okay, everybody says it makes sense. Do you have any questions about that paper? Is there anything that I covered that I went too quickly and you were like, wait, what? Is there anything that doesn't make sense, or does that all make sense? Remember,
I think I'm good.
go ahead. You
Oh,
don't
I
have
just said I think I'm good.
Okay, so if you have a question though, feel free to ask it. Remember, people watching the video can't. So they're like, darn it, I wish I'd been there so I could ask that question. But if you don't have a question, that's cool. We will end this here. And if there is anything that you need, you just holler at me, you guys, okay? Remember, next week, I'm not, like, we don't have class. We don't have any chats on Mondays and Tuesdays or anything like that, but I will be here. So please, please, please let me know if you have questions on anything, okay? And feel free, when
Okay.
you're doing the journals, put questions in there too, because I can answer all of that stuff individually, and I will. First, though, I'm trying to grade all these papers. And it is a mountain. And I am not picking away at it very quickly. I'm really giving people a lot of feedback, so it's taking me forever. So, but hopefully, I mean, you will definitely get your papers back by Monday or Tuesday of next week, if not this week. So I'll do my best. Any other questions?
Will we resume our chats after break is over?
Yes, we still
Same
have
time?
2 more weeks after that of regular classes. So we'll have the Monday, and remember on Thursday of this week, I don't know that we'll chat. It depends on what my students are doing. Yeah, you'll be able to. I'll post all of these videos tomorrow morning, but we will definitely chat the Monday and Tuesday after Christmas. I mean Christmas, after Thanksgiving break, and then the Monday and Tuesday after that. And that should wrap everything up. I may have to cover some things ahead for the Tempest and whatever, but I probably won't, because you still have due dates and things. But I'll look at it. I'll make sure I don't ruin any endings for you guys, okay? So have a great break. Read as much as you can, and let me know what you want to write your paper about, okay?
Okay.
See you guys.
Bye.